The teapot on the sideboard had been silver once, and in a certain slant of morning light it still remembered the fact, though the fact itself had been sold. It stood at the end of the long oak table in the breakfast room of Hollowmere, and it was the first thing a stranger noticed on entering that room, because it was polished each dawn by a pair of hands that had learned, at 17, to polish what could not be kept. Whoever polished it did not own it. Whoever owned it did not touch it. And between those two facts lay the whole of the story that follows, though the teapot, being a teapot, did not know that yet, and neither did the girl who was, at that hour, breathing on its lid. She was 6 and 10 when the pot came into her keeping, and 7 and 10 when she began to serve at the table it stood on, and it is with that second year that we must begin. Though to understand the second year one must first understand the debt that had made it possible. That debt is where we shall be going presently, and from it every quiet cruelty in this house descends by a straight line, as an heir descends from a name. For now it is enough to say that the teapot was polished, and the room was cold, and the fire in the grate had been laid with the smallest quantity of coal that could still be called a fire, and the girl who had done the laying was, at that moment, on her knees before it, listening for footsteps overhead. Her name was Marin Ashcroft, and she was the wife of the Duke of Hollowmere, and no person in the house addressed her as either. To the housekeeper she was the young mistress, said in the flat voice kept for facts one has been ordered to observe. To the cook she was the child, said with the tenderness of a woman who had lost 3 of her own and refused to lose a 4th. To the Duke's mother, when the Duke's mother could be brought to speak of her at all, she was that girl. To the Duke himself she was nothing that had been named aloud in 6 months, for he had not spoken to her since the morning after the ceremony, when he had told her, in the tone of a man reciting the terms of a lease, that she would live at Hollowmere until such time as he required otherwise, that she would take no allowance, that she would answer to Mrs. Denner for the running of the linen presses, and that she would understand, once and forever, that the arrangement between them was no arrangement at all, but the discharging of a debt her father had signed in a room she had never entered. She had answered, standing very straight, that she understood and had not been asked whether she understood anything else, and had gone from the room, and had not wept, and had counted, as she went down the long corridor to the servants' stair that she had already, by then, been told to use, the number of the paintings she passed, of which there were 9, and the number of the windows, of which there were 7, and the number of years she supposed she might yet have to live in such a place, of which she could not then form any guess at all. Enumerated composure was, from that morning, her chief inheritance. She would carry it, with the teapot, for the whole of the story. Her father had been a small, tidy, tired man who had spent 30 years apologizing for the ambitions of others and had none left of his own. He had loved his daughter and his ledgers in that order, and had failed at the second because he could not bear to press the first upon anyone, and when the pressing was pressed upon him instead, by a creditor whose patience had thinned to paper, he had done what small, tidy, tired men do, which is to sign what is set before them, and to sit up all night afterward with a candle and no cup, and to look at the door of the room where his daughter slept, and to remember her at 4, when she had made him a cake of clay and served it with the gravity of a countess. He died within the 12-month, of nothing that any physician could name, which is to say of the signing. The paper he had signed was held by the late Duke of Hollowmere, who had, in his own turn, been a man of open hand and closed accounts, and who, being dying, had passed the paper to his son with an instruction that the son had not liked and had not disobeyed. The instruction was that the debt should be discharged by marriage, that the girl should be given the name of Ashcroft and the roof of Hollowmere, and that she should be permitted thereby not to be sold to a man who would use her worse. The late Duke, being dying, had believed this to be a kindness. His son, being living, had believed it to be a sentence, and had carried it out with the correctness of a man carrying a sentence, and had not, in the carrying, thought once of what the sentence might feel like from the other side of the paper. He was, at that season, 26, and had already learned to keep his face still, and had not yet learned that keeping a face still is not the same as being still inside it. His name was Ewan Ashcroft, 7th Duke of Hollowmere, and the county had for 2 years considered him the coldest man in it. He was said to be devoted to his duties, though no one in the county could name one. He was said to be devoted also to a certain Lady Corisande Vane, whose people held the neighboring estate of Marchmore, and who was, at every gathering of consequence, seated at his right, and whose gloves he had, in the sight of many, retrieved from a settee, and returned to her hand with a bow an inch shallower than courtesy required, which was, in Corisande's own reading, an inch deeper than courtesy allowed. What his devotion to her actually consisted of, no person could have said, for he did not speak of her when she was absent. And he did not smile at her when she was present, and he took her hand in his own the way another man might take a rein, as an object that had been placed in his keeping, and that he did not intend to drop. It was not love, it was the shape love had left in him when it had gone out. For he had loved once, 7 years before, a girl whose name shall not be written here, because he had not written it himself in 7 years, and she had died of a fever in a house he had not been permitted to enter, and he had been told of it in a letter that had reached him 3 days late, and he had gone out that evening into the rain without a coat, and had come back at dawn with a cough that had lasted the winter, and he had not, since that winter, permitted himself the luxury of any door he could not close behind him. He had chosen Corisande because Corisande was a door that closed. He had chosen the debt marriage because the debt marriage was a door that had been closed for him. And he had believed, in the correctness of a man who has arranged his rooms to be uninhabited, that no further door remained in the house to be opened. This belief was, as beliefs of that kind tend to be, false, and the falsehood had begun to be exposed on the very morning when we found Marin Ashcroft on her knees before the small fire, listening for footsteps overhead, though neither the Duke nor his wife nor his mistress yet knew that the exposure had begun. It began, as such things do, with a teapot. Corisande Vane had come to breakfast at Hollowmere, as she came 3 mornings in the week, at the invitation of the Duke's mother, who preferred her company to any other, and who had, upon the marriage, taken it upon herself to establish, by tireless small offices, that Corisande was, in every particular except the register at the parish church, the mistress of the house. On this morning she wore pale rose, and her hair had been dressed by a maid brought over from Marchmore for the purpose, and she came into the breakfast room with the light following her, as light did, and she took the seat at the Duke's right without waiting to be shown to it, and she said, in the low musical voice that had been trained in 3 cities, that she had heard the strangest report in the village and must, she was afraid, share it with him at once. The Duke, who had risen when she entered and had bowed the necessary inch, sat down again, and said, in the flat voice he kept for Corisande, that he was at her disposal. He did not look at the doorway through which, at that instant, his wife was carrying the tea. Marin carried it in both hands, because both hands were required, and she set it on the sideboard, and she took from the sideboard the small china cup that had been laid at the Duke's place, and the second cup at Corisande's, and she filled the first, and carried it to him, and set it at his hand without a word, and she filled the second, and carried it to Corisande, and set it at her hand, and she did not, at either setting, look into either face. She had been ordered, on the morning after the ceremony, that she should serve at breakfast when Lady Vane was present, and that she should serve as any other maid served, and that she should not, on any account, sit. She had answered that she understood. She had, since then, understood a great many things, and had said none of them. Corisande did not, at first, acknowledge her. This was Corisande's habit. She discussed with the Duke the strange report, which concerned a farmer in the village whose wife had run off with a peddler, and which was neither strange nor a report, but a story she had assembled that morning to have something to bring to the table, and she laughed once, in the middle of it. A small trained laugh that was, in its way, more offensive than any shout, for it obliged the Duke to smile, and he did not smile, which obliged her to laugh again more thinly and to reach for her cup. As she reached, she looked, for the first time, at the girl who had set it there, and she said, in the same musical voice, still addressed nominally to the Duke, that she did wonder how it was that the tea at Hollowmere had grown, of late, so peculiarly weak. The Duke did not answer. His mother, at the foot of the table, answered for him, and said that the tea was as it had always been, and that if Lady Vane found it wanting, one had only to give the order, and it would be corrected. She did not look at Marin either. No one at the table looked at Marin, except, for one instant, the Duke, whose eyes went to her hands and away again so quickly that no person could have said the glance had occurred, except Marin herself, who felt it as one feels a draught through a shut window, and who did not turn her head. She stood at the sideboard with her hands folded before her, in the posture Mrs. Denner had taught her, and she counted the seconds until she should be permitted to withdraw, of which there were, by her count, 1:40 before Corisande, having tasted the tea and set it down again with a small deliberate sigh, said that it would do, that it would have to do, and that she supposed one could not, in a house that had been left to run itself, expect otherwise. It was at the word otherwise that Marin, who had not moved, did an unpermitted thing. She smiled. It was not, properly, a smile. It was the beginning of a smile that did not finish, a tightening at one corner of the mouth so small that it would not have been visible to any person not looking for it, and only one person at the table at that moment was looking for it, and it was not Corisande, and it was not the Duke's mother, and it was not any of the 3 servants at the wall. It was the Duke, and the beginning of a smile that did not finish was, to a man who had spent 7 years refusing to finish his own, a thing he was constitutionally equipped to notice. He noticed it. He looked down at his cup. He said nothing. And so, on the 11th of a month whose name did not matter, a door opened in a house he had believed closed to further doors, though he did not yet know it had opened, and neither did she. And everything that came after began in that hour. To understand why the beginning of a smile that did not finish was a door, and why the Duke was equipped to see the door and not. Yet, equipped to walk through it, we must go back a little further, to a spring 7 years before the spring of the teapot, when Ewan Ashcroft was 19 years of age and had not yet learned to keep his face still. He had then a laugh, and it was a laugh that people who had heard it remembered, and it was a laugh he had spent, in one evening, upon a girl he was not permitted to marry. The girl's father was a physician in a town 2 days' ride from Hollowmere. The girl's dowry, had she possessed one, would not have filled the smallest of the ledgers in the Hollowmere office, and the late Duke, who had loved his son as such fathers love, which is to say with pride and with dread in almost equal measure, had told his son that the matter must end, and had told him so kindly, and had told him so twice, and had told him so a 3rd time when kindness had not sufficed. On the 4th telling he had not been kind, and Ewan had ridden out that night, and had come back 3 days later, and had said nothing to any person of what had passed in the 3 days, and the matter had, by all appearances, ended. It had not ended. It had gone underground. He had gone on writing to her, and she to him, in letters carried by a groom who could not read, and the letters had continued, in secret, through a spring and a summer and into an autumn, and in the autumn she had taken the fever, and in the winter she had died, and the letter that had reached him in the winter was the letter he had not been permitted to answer. Because by the time he had ridden the 2 days to her father's house, the small stone had already been set in the small yard behind the small chapel, and there was nothing to answer to except the stone. He had answered the stone. He had knelt before it, in the rain, for a length of time no person had counted, and he had said to it 3 things, of which the first was a request for forgiveness for having believed his father, and the second was a promise, and the third was a name. The promise was that he would not, again, love a person he could not defend. The name was hers, said aloud for the last time. He had risen from the stone and ridden home, and had entered his father's library, and had told his father, in the same flat voice he would later keep for facts, that he would marry as his father wished, when his father wished, whom his father wished, and that nothing further need be spoken between them on the subject, and his father, who was a man of open hand and closed accounts, had looked at his son for a long moment, and had opened his mouth, and had closed it again, and had never, until the paper on his deathbed, spoken of the matter again. He believed, of the paper on his deathbed, that he was undoing his own cruelty. He was not. He was only distributing it to a party who had not been present at the original transaction, which is what cruelty of that kind, being an inheritance, tends to do. So it was that Merrin Ashcroft, aged 17, orphaned in the same 12-month, brought to Hollowmere in a hired chaise with 1 trunk of mended linen and a copy of her mother's prayer book, was married in the small chapel of the estate on a morning in October, by a curate who had been given the license the night before, and had not, by daylight, quite recovered from the surprise, and the Duke, standing at her side, wore black, as was his habit, and spoke his portion in a voice audible to the curate and no farther, and Merrin, in a gown that had been her mother's, and had been let out at the seams for the occasion, said her portion in the clear, steady voice of a girl who has decided, in advance, that she will not cry, and no bells were rung, and no breakfast was served. And the Duke handed his bride into the chaise that would take her the short mile to the great house, and did not himself get in, and rode instead at a distance upon a horse that was as black as his coat, and the last thing Merrin saw, before the chaise turned into the avenue of limes, was the curate standing in the chapel door, with a look upon his face that she was, by then, already learning to read, the look of a man who has performed a rite he has not in his heart sanctioned. She had reached the house. She had been shown to a small room in the east wing that had once, Mrs. Denner said, without meeting her eye, been the room of a governess. She had been given, that first evening, a supper of bread and cheese upon a tray, and had been told that breakfast in the great room began at 8, and that she would be expected. She had been expected. She had, on the second morning, entered the great room in the gown she had been married in, having no other, and the Duke's mother, who had not been at the ceremony, and had learned of it by letter from her son, had looked at her once from the head of the table and had said, to no one, that she supposed one would grow accustomed. Merrin had understood then that she would not be given a chair. She had gone to the sideboard, and had asked, in a voice as steady as she could make it, whether she might be of service, and Mrs. Denner, who was standing at the sideboard, had, without turning, handed her the teapot. And Merrin had taken it. And she had held it, that first morning, in both hands, because both hands were required, and she had learned, in the holding of it, that a teapot is heavier than it looks, and that the handle is warm, and that if one grips the handle correctly, one need not, however greatly one might wish to, drop it. She had not dropped it. She had not, in the 7 months since, dropped anything. That she had also not, in the 7 months, been spoken to by her husband was a fact she had folded into the linen with the other unspeakable things, and had put away. We shall take a very short break here. If you are enjoying this story, please take a moment to subscribe so you will not miss what happens next. There is a manner of endurance that looks, from without, like meekness, and is not meekness at all, but the setting of a very small light in a very dark room, and the tending of it, and the refusal to permit any wind that enters at any door to blow it out. This was Marin's manner, and it had been learned not at Hollowmere, but at her father's kitchen table in the last winter of his life. When the coal had been rationed and the candles counted and the ledgers gone over 3 times by the small, tidy-tired man who could not make the columns agree, and Marin, then 16, had sat opposite him and had held the second candle steady while he wrote, and had said nothing, and had not asked what the columns meant, though she had, by then, guessed, she had learned, in that winter, that a light is not tended by great gestures, it is tended by the quiet hand that does not shake. And she had brought that hand with her to Hollowmere, and she was tending, now, whatever light she had, in the kitchen, and in the linen press, and at the sideboard, and, though she did not yet call it by that name, in the great, cold library where the Duke sat, 3 evenings in the week, at accounts he did not enjoy, and did not delegate. For the second thing that had begun, though no person in the house had marked it, was that Marin had begun to notice the accounts. She had noticed them because she had, one afternoon in November, been sent by Mrs. Denner into the library to fetch a book of household expenses that Mrs. Denner had left there on the Duke's desk, and she had lifted the book, and beneath it lay a second book, open, and in the second book she had seen, without looking for it, a column of figures, and beside the column a set of small pencil marks in the margin, and among the pencil marks a single figure that did not agree with the figure beside it. She had not been trained in accounts. She had sat, however, in a winter kitchen with a small, tidy, tired man, and she had held the second candle, and she knew, as such holders come to know, what a figure that does not agree with its neighbor looks like. She had closed the second book. She had taken the first. She had gone out of the library without hurry. And she had said nothing to any person. She had not said nothing because she was afraid, though she was, in her way, afraid. She had said nothing because she did not yet know whose hand had made the pencil marks, and she did not yet know whether the figure that did not agree had been made to disagree by accident or by intent, and she did not intend, being a girl who had once held the second candle, to accuse any person on the strength of a single glance. She resolved, instead, to look again when next she should be sent into the library, and to look, if she could, at the book beneath the book. This resolve she carried, folded, with the other folded things. She will look again, in due course, and what she sees will be part of the debt this story is here to discharge, but it is not the whole debt, and we must, for now, set it beside the teapot on the sideboard and go on. The Duke, that same November, had begun to notice her hands. He had noticed them, at first, without knowing he was noticing them, in the way a man in a cold room notices, without knowing it, a small warmth at his elbow that he cannot account for, and he had, one morning, looked down at his cup after she had set it there, and had seen that the cup was set precisely square to the edge of the saucer, and that the saucer was set precisely square to the edge of the cloth, and that the small silver spoon lay precisely across the cup at the angle he himself had. since boyhood, preferred, though no person had ever asked him what angle he preferred, and no person had ever, in living memory, said it so. He had lifted the cup, he had drunk, he had said nothing. He had noticed also, that same week, that when he came in from riding, his boots, upon being taken off in the small room at the back of the house, were if she had passed through, standing paired at the correct distance from the door, and that if she had not passed through they were where the boy had dropped them. He had noticed this, and had not asked, and had not thanked, and had, on the third morning of the pairing, stood for a moment in the small room looking at the boots, and had then, without quite knowing why, gone up the servants' stair by mistake, and had turned at the top, and had come down again by the main stair, and had said nothing to any person of the mistake. It had been the first mistake he had made in a house of that kind in 7 years, and it was, though he did not know it, a door. Corisande, who noticed doors before their handles had been touched, had begun in the same November to visit Heir more often than 3 mornings in the week. She had visited, one morning on a pretext of returning a book that had not been lent. She had visited another to inquire after the health of the Duke's mother, who was in perfect health. She had, on a third visit, brought a small posy of hothouse flowers, which she had presented to the Duke's mother with the air of a woman who does not, ordinarily, carry posies, and she had, upon presenting them, looked past the Duke's mother, over her shoulder at the girl at the sideboard, and had held the look one instant too long, and had, in that instant, learned 2 things. She had learned that the girl at the sideboard was not so plain as the county had reported, and she had learned that the Duke, who had entered the room behind her with the newspaper folded in his hand, had, upon Corisande's entering, glanced first at the sideboard, and had glanced only after that at Corisande. It was a glance of the smallest quantity, a fraction of a second, and there was in it no warmth, no acknowledgement, no anything a jealous woman might have taken hold of and shaken. But Corisande was not a jealous woman in the ordinary sense. She was a woman who had, since 15, calculated her position by fractions of a second, and she knew what a fraction of a second cost, and she knew when it was being spent, and she knew, that morning, that a very small currency had begun to be spent, in the wrong direction, in the room she had for 2 years considered her own. She said nothing. She smiled at the Duke's mother. She smiled at the Duke. She did not smile at the girl. She went home to Marchmore in her carriage with the flowers she had, on the way back thrown from the window into a ditch, and by that evening she had determined, with the calm, settled clarity of a woman writing an entry in a ledger, that the girl at the sideboard would have to be removed. She did not yet know how. She trusted that a means would present itself. A means, in her experience, always did. The means presented itself, as such means do, in the person of Mr. Shard. Halgrove Prine, who had been for 32 years the steward of Heir, and who had, in that time, laid 2 dukes into the ground, and who was, at the age of 59, a small, tidy, tired man who bore, though no person in the house had ever remarked it, a distant resemblance to Marin's father, and who had, unlike Marin's father, spent the last decade of his tidiness making figures that did not agree with their neighbors. He had done it in quantities so small, and over years so numerous, that the sum laid out would have astonished even himself. And he had done it not from greed, which was a passion foreign to his cold constitution, but from fear, which was a passion he understood entirely. He had a sister in a town 2 days' ride away, who was ill, and he had a nephew who had been placed in a bank in the capital and had disgraced himself there, and he had, for both these matters, been called upon in confidence for sums he did not, in confidence, possess. He had, therefore, in the manner of small, tidy-tired men who do not possess what is called upon, borrowed the sums from the only pocket to which he had access, which was the pocket of the estate, and he had, in the manner of such borrowers, intended to restore what he had borrowed, and had not restored it, and had borrowed further, and the pencil marks in the margins of the second book were his, though the hand that had made them was, by then, no longer quite steady. It was the pencil marks that Marin had seen. It was, though she did not know his name, Mr. Prine's fear that she had seen. Mr. Prine had not, at first, marked her. He had marked her on the 3rd of December, when he had, entering the library at an hour he had not expected any person to enter it, seen the young mistress standing at the desk with a book open before her that was not the household book, and had seen her close it, without haste, and turn to him, and say, in the clear, steady voice of a girl who has decided, in advance, that she will not lie, that she had been sent by Mrs. Denner for the household book, and had, by mistake, opened another. He had said, in the flat voice he kept for facts, that no harm was done. She had gone. He had stood a long time at the desk after she had gone, and had opened the book she had been looking at, and had looked at the page she had been looking at, and had seen that she had been looking, if she had been looking at anything, at the pencil marks. He had turned very cold, then, and had sat down. And he had determined, in the calm, settled clarity of a small, tidy-tired man who has, for a decade, been afraid that the young mistress would have to be removed. He did not yet know how. He trusted that a means would present itself. It did. It presented itself, 3 days later, in the drawing-room of Marchmore, where he had been summoned by Lady Corisande Vane on a pretext of estate business, and where he had sat, in a small chair, opposite a woman who had, by then, made her own determination, and where, without either party stating the matter directly, an understanding had been arrived at between them, of a kind that is arrived at in polite rooms every day, and that has, in every generation, made rooms colder than they need have been. Marin was to be removed. The pencil marks were to remain unremarked. Neither party knew, upon rising, the whole of what the other had done. Each knew enough to be certain that the other would not, now, betray them. They shook hands, in a manner of speaking. They did not shake hands. Corisande did not shake hands with stewards. But an understanding was arrived at, and Mr. Prine went home to Hollowmere in the dusk, with a small warm relief at the pit of his stomach that he mistook, as such men do, for peace, and Corisande went to bed that night, having composed, in her head, 3 separate rumors, of which she intended, over the coming weeks, to release one, and which one she would decide upon the direction of the wind. Meanwhile, the Duke, who knew nothing of any of these transactions, had begun to make further mistakes. He had, on the 4th of December, entered the small parlor at an hour when he had not been expected, and had found his wife there alone, seated at the window with a piece of mending in her lap, and had stopped in the doorway, and had said, in a voice he had not quite meant to use, that he had not known she used this room. She had risen, quickly, and had said that she would go. He had said, before he knew he was going to say it, that she need not. She had sat down again, slowly, and had bent her head over the mending, and he had stood in the doorway for the length of time it takes a clock to strike the quarter, and had not entered, and had not left, and had at last said, in the flat voice he kept for facts, that the light in this room was better than in the library, and that he would, if she did not object, take his book to the chair by the fire. She had not objected. She had not looked up. He had crossed the room, and had sat down in the chair by the fire, and had opened his book, and had not read one line of it, and had heard, for the first time in 7 years, the sound of a needle going through cloth in a room where he was permitted to sit, and he had, at the end of an hour, risen, and had said, in a voice a shade less flat than the flat voice, that he would not again disturb her, and she had lifted her head, and had said, without smiling, that he had not disturbed her, and he had gone out, and had, in the corridor, stood still for a moment with his hand on the wall, in the posture of a man who has been struck a very small blow that he was not braced for. He had, that evening, done a thing he had not done in 7 years. He had, in the library, opened the small locked drawer of his desk, and had taken from it a folded letter, and had held it in his hand, and had put it back, unopened, and had locked the drawer. He had not, in the 7 years, opened the letter either. He was not ready. But he had taken it out, which was more than he had done in any of the 7 Decembers preceding, and it was, though he did not know it, a door. The winter closed in around Hollowmere, as winters of that country will, in a series of small acts of concealment, the avenue vanishing beneath a hand of snow, the lake stopping mid-ripple, the smoke of the village going straight up as though drawn by a plumb line, and beneath these concealments the household went on as it had always gone on, and beneath the household certain small motions went on that no person had marked, and beneath those small motions certain further motions were preparing themselves, and Corisande had chosen her rumor. The rumor she had chosen was the mildest of the 3, and therefore the most dangerous, for it was the one that could be told without malice by persons who bore no malice, and could therefore travel farthest. It was that the young Duchess of Hollowmere, being of a nervous constitution and much attached to the memory of her late father, had begun to be seen wandering the corridors of the great house at night, and that a certain small locket, which had belonged to the late Duke, and had been, since his death, kept upon the mantel of the small drawing-room, had been missed, and had not been found, and was suspected, by persons whose names would not be pressed for, to have been carried off by hands that had, of late, had a great deal to do with silver. The rumor was not, in the first week, told to the Duke. It was told to the Duke's mother. The Duke's mother, upon hearing it, had done what women of that generation do, which is to say, she had thanked the teller for her discretion, and had wept privately, and had said nothing to her son, and had, on the first evening she could arrange it, walked into the small drawing-room and looked at the mantel. The locket was not there. Mr. Prine had removed it 3 days before, at Corisande's suggestion, and had put it into the pocket of the young mistress's cloak, which hung, at that season, upon a peg in the small back passage that no person passed but the servants and Marin herself. It was a competent piece of work. It was, in that generation, considered a very old device, and had been, in the reading of the Duke's mother, unanswerable. The Duke's mother had, upon finding the mantel empty, gone up to her own room, and had sat there a great while, and had at last sent for Mrs. Denner. Mrs. Denner had come. She had not been asked, directly, whether the young mistress had been seen at night in the corridors, for the Duke's mother was not so vulgar as to ask directly. She had been asked whether there had been any irregularity of late, of which the housekeeper ought to have made mention, and Mrs. Denner, who had, in 7 months, formed a judgment of the young mistress that she had not made mention of either, had said, in the flat voice she kept for facts one has been ordered to observe, that there had been no irregularity of which she was aware. The Duke's mother had thanked her. Mrs. Denner had withdrawn. In the corridor, she had stood still for the length of time it takes a clock to strike the quarter, and had then gone down to the kitchen, and had said to the cook, who was that year the only person in the house she trusted, that a wind had begun to blow in the house that she did not like. The cook, who had lost 3 of her own and had refused to lose a 4th, had not answered. She had only, that evening, made the young mistress's supper a shade warmer than the order required, and had, in the folding of the napkin upon the tray, folded also a small piece of bread that had not been included in the order, and the tray had gone up and had come down empty, and no person had spoken. The rumor, having been told to the Duke's mother without being told to the Duke, had had leave to walk about the county for a fortnight before it reached him, and it reached him, at last, not from Corisande, who had the sense not to bring it, but from a neighbor at a hunt breakfast who mentioned it, in the manner of such neighbors, as a thing he had heard and did not, of course, believe, but had thought his host would wish to know. The Duke had heard him out. He had thanked him. He had ridden home in the middle of the day, which was not his habit. He had entered the great house without removing his coat. He had gone directly to the small drawing room and had looked at the mantel and had seen the empty place and had stood a moment before it. He had then gone up to his mother's rooms and had asked her, in the flat voice he kept for facts, whether the locket had been misplaced. His mother had told him. She had not accused. She had only told. He had heard her out. He had gone down the great stair, and along the corridor, and through the small back passage, and had lifted the young mistress's cloak from its peg, and had put his hand into the pocket, and had drawn out the locket. It lay in his palm. He looked at it a long time. He did not, at first, believe what his hand told him. He believed it, at last, because the hand had never lied to him about a fact, and he had, standing in the small back passage, with the locket in his palm and his coat still on, and the snow melting from his shoulders onto the floor, felt a thing he had not felt in 7 years, which was rage, and had felt close after it. And closer than he had expected, another thing, which he did not, at first, name, and which was the refusal of belief. He had stood there for the length of time it takes a clock to strike the quarter. Then he had put the locket back into the pocket of the cloak, and had put the cloak back upon the peg, and had gone up to his library, and had sat down at his desk, and had said aloud, to no person, in the flat voice he kept for facts, that he would not act upon a thing until he had understood it. This resolution, in a man of his making, was worth more than any oath, and it was, though he did not know it, the door swinging open. He did not, however, act at once, and Corisande, who had counted upon his acting at once, had begun, by the end of the fortnight, to grow uneasy. She had expected an interview. She had expected an ejection. She had expected a small, quiet scandal, and a small, quiet gratitude from the Duke's mother, and a small, quiet reassumption of the seat at the Duke's right that she had, all winter, felt slipping by fractions of a second from beneath her. She had received none of these things. She had received, instead, 3 mornings in a row, an unchanged breakfast, the Duke at his place, the mother at hers, the young mistress at the sideboard, the tea unremarked, the locket, so far as she could tell without asking, unmentioned. On the 3rd morning she had, at last, brought a fresh rumor with her, in the hope of quickening the first, and she had, at the table, mentioned, in the same musical voice, that she had heard the strangest report from the village, which concerned the young Duchess and a certain groom, and which she was, she said, quite certain was untrue. She had not looked at the sideboard, she had looked at the Duke. The Duke had lifted his cup and had set it down again with the small silver spoon precisely at the angle he preferred, and had said, in a voice she had never before heard him use, and would never afterward forget, that he would trouble Lady Vane not to bring, again, to his table, any report concerning any person under his roof, of whatever station, whose truth she was quite certain of otherwise. He had said it without raising his voice. He had said it without looking at her. He had said it, indeed, to his cup, and the room had gone as still as a room goes when a small fire is snuffed by a very steady hand, and Corisande, who had, since 15, calculated her position by fractions of a second, understood that a very great quantity of currency had just been spent, in one sentence, in the wrong direction, and that she would not, this morning, recover it. She had smiled. She had inquired after the Duke's mother's headache. She had risen, at last, and had taken her leave, and she had gone home to Marchmore in her carriage in a silence that her maid, sitting opposite her, was afterward heard to describe as not to be borne. At the sideboard, Marin, who had not moved during the sentence and had not looked up during the silence, had felt, for the first time in 7 months, a warmth at her elbow that she could not, at first, account for, and she had, in the counting of the seconds until she should be permitted to withdraw, of which there were, that morning, 12 fewer than usual, understood without being told that a thing had shifted in the room, and that it had shifted, in some part, in her direction. She had not permitted herself to think what the shift meant. She had folded it, with the other unfolded things, and had carried it, with the teapot, back to the kitchen, and she had, that afternoon, been sent into the library again, upon another errand, and had, again, looked at the second book, and had seen that the pencil marks had increased, and had counted them, and had, this time, in the clear, steady clarity of a girl who has decided in advance that she will not be afraid, done a thing she had not done before. She had taken a small piece of paper from the desk and had copied, in her own hand, the figures of 1 page, and had folded the paper and had put it in the pocket of her apron and had left the library. She did not yet know to whom she would give the paper. She trusted that a person would present themselves. A person did. The person who presented themselves was, of all persons in the house, the Duke, and the presentation occurred in the small parlor on the evening of the same day, where he had, again, come with a book, and had, again, taken the chair by the fire, and had, this time, not opened the book. He had, instead, said in a voice a shade less flat than the flat voice, that he had, that morning, spoken sharply to a lady at his table, and that he did not wish the young mistress of the house to suppose the sharpness had been on any account save that a report had been made at his table, which he had known, before it was made, to be untrue. Marin had lifted her head from her mending. She had looked at him for the first time in 7 months, fully, without lowering her eyes, and he had looked at her, in the same way, from the chair by the fire, and there had passed between them, in that look, a thing that no other person in the house had seen, and that neither of them, being what they were, would have known how to name. She had said, at last, in the clear, steady voice of a girl who has decided, in advance, that she will not weep, that she was grateful, and that she would speak, if he permitted her, of another matter that had been, of late, in her keeping. He had said, in the flat voice he kept for facts, that he permitted her. She had taken the folded paper from the pocket of her apron. She had held it out. He had taken it. He had unfolded it. He had looked at it a long moment, and he had said at last, in a voice a shade less flat still, that he understood, and had not, in the saying, understood the whole of it, but had understood enough to know that he did not, from that hour, sleep as he had slept, and that a promise he had made, 7 years before, to a small stone in a small yard, had at last come due, and would at last be paid, though not, as he had once supposed, by refusal, and not, as he had once supposed, by silence, but by the taking of a hand across a hearth in a small parlor at Hollowmere on an evening when the snow was straight down and the smoke of the village went up like a plumb line, and a small silver teapot stood on a sideboard in a cold breakfast room, and dreamed, in a certain slant of morning light, of what it had been before it had been sold. It was on a Thursday in February at the Great Winter Assembly at Marchmoor, to which all the county came, and from which no person of consequence could be spared, that the matter was, at last, brought into the open. And it was brought into the open, as such matters are, by the very person who had most wished it kept closed, and it was brought there in the mildest tone, in a room full of candles, in the sight of some 70 persons in their best silks, and in the hearing of the entire hierarchy of the county from the bishop downward, and it was, from the first sentence, a thing that could not be recalled. Corisande had planned the assembly for weeks. She had planned, in it, a small triumph. She had planned to seat the Duke at her right, to be led by him into the first set, to receive from him the courtesies that had been, for 2 years, hers by unspoken tenure, and she had planned, at some quiet moment near the middle of the evening, to draw him aside, and to speak to him, gently, in the manner of a woman, with only his interest at heart. Of a certain unhappy business concerning a locket, and a certain unhappy report concerning a groom, and to leave him understanding that the young Duchess of Hollowmere was not what she had at first appeared, and that arrangements, as arrangements are made, would perhaps be best. She had therefore arranged the whole evening upon the assumption that the young Duchess of Hollowmere would not be present. The young Duchess of Hollowmere was present. She was present because the Duke had, on the morning of the assembly, ordered his carriage for 2, and had gone up, himself to the east wing, and had knocked at the door of the small room that had once been the room of a governess, and had said, through the door, that he would wait in the hall for his wife, and that he trusted his wife would be ready in an hour, and Marin, who had, until that knock, believed she would spend the evening, as she had spent every other, at the sideboard or at her mending, had answered, through the door, that she would be ready, and had, in the hour, put on the only gown she had that was not the gown she had been married in, which was a plain dark blue, that had been her mother's second best, let out at the seams, and turned once. And she had come down the great stair at the appointed hour, with her hair dressed by her own hands, and her mother's small pearl at her throat, and her hand steady upon the rail, and the Duke, standing in the hall in his black, had bowed to her, an inch deeper than courtesy required, and had handed her into the carriage, and had, on the road to Marchmoor, said nothing, which she understood, and which she preferred. They had entered the ballroom together. Corisande, at the head of the receiving line, had seen them enter, and had felt, for the first time in her life, the cold small drop in the chest that is the beginning of true fear, and she had, being what she was, mastered it in half a second, and had come forward with both hands out, and had greeted the Duke as she greeted him always, and had greeted the young Duchess with a smile of a warmth so precisely calibrated that any person in the room who had not been watching for it would have taken it for kindness. The Duke had bowed. Marin had curtsied, an inch neither too shallow nor too deep. And the room, which had, at their entrance, gone very slightly quieter, had resumed its music. The evening had gone forward, as such evenings do, in figures and turns and glasses of a pale wine and small clusters of talk at the edges of the room. The Duke had led the young Duchess into the first set. He had not led Corisande into any set. He had, between the second and the third, brought his wife a glass of the pale wine, and had stood beside her at the window while she drank it, and had, in that standing, done what he had not, in the whole of the 7 years, done in the presence of the county. He had bent his head to hear what she said. It was not a private conversation. He inquired after the temperature of the room. She replied that it was warm. He inquired after her comfort. She replied that she was well, but he had bent his head, and the county, which measures such matters in fractions of an inch, had seen the bending, and had marked it, and Corisande, at the far end of the room, had seen it too, and had understood that her evening was already lost, and had therefore determined, in the calm, settled clarity of a woman who has spent her currency, to spend the last of it now, all at once. In the middle of the room, before witnesses, upon a stake she could no longer afford to keep. She had, upon the striking of 10 by the great clock, come forward, with her mother's oldest friend upon her arm, and had stopped at the group in which the Duke and his wife were standing, and had said, in the low musical voice, that she must beg the Duke's pardon for a small intrusion, but that a matter had reached her that she was, in conscience, unable to keep from him longer, and that she would, if permitted, speak it in company, since she had no wish to speak it in corners. The Duke had inclined his head. He had not spoken. He had, in the 7 years, learned, if he had learned nothing else, that silence is a longer weapon than speech, and he had waited. Corisande had spoken. She had spoken with such gentleness that the 70 persons around them had drawn imperceptibly closer to hear. She had spoken of a locket that had been missing at Hollowmere since November, and of the great grief of the Duke's mother at its loss, and of the great delicacy with which the household had endeavored to spare his grace the knowledge of it. And she had spoken of a certain groom at Hollowmere, and of a report that had travelled, she was sorry to say, in the village, and she had said, at the end, with her eyes bright with what she trusted the room would read as sorrow, that she would not, for the world, have brought these matters into the light, had she not felt that the Duke, above all, had the right to know what was said, in whispers, of the person who bore his name. The room was as still as a room is that has stopped breathing. Marin stood at the Duke's side with the empty glass in her hand, and did not lower her eyes, and did not raise them beyond the middle distance, and the Duke did not look at her, and the Duke's mother, who had come, at the sound of the first sentence, quietly to stand at his other side, looked at the floor. The Duke let then the length of time it takes a clock to strike the quarter go by in silence. He counted it. Marin counted it also, though neither of them afterward said so. It was a very long quarter. And at the end of it he raised his head, and he looked, first, not at Corisande, but around the room, at the 70 faces turned toward him, and he said, in a voice pitched to the last person at the last edge, and as flat as a slab of stone, and as steady, that he would answer Lady Vane's kindness in kind, and would speak the whole of the matter also in company, since it had, by her doing, become a matter of company. He said that the locket which had been missing from the mantel of the small drawing-room at Hollowmere had been found, in November, in the pocket of the cloak of his wife, upon a peg in the small back passage, by his own hand, and had lain there since. He said that he had not, upon finding it there, believed his wife to have taken it, and did not now believe it, because he had watched her for 7 months, and knew, as a man knows what a hand of his own has laid down, what she was and what she was not, and because he had since ascertained, upon evidence he would not in company disclose, but would be prepared to disclose in a court of law upon any application, whose hand had in fact placed the locket where it had been found, and by whose suggestion, and to what end. He said that the report concerning a certain groom, which Lady Vane had done him the honor of not naming, was a report that had never left the drawing-room in which it had been composed, and had been composed, he had reason to believe, in a house not 2 miles from where they stood, and that he would ask no person present to consider the character of a woman upon the strength of a rumor, since a rumor was, by his understanding, only a mirror of the mouth that had shaped it, and he would prefer the room to consider, instead, the character of the mouth. He said that he had, in the last month, come to know his wife, and that he had come to know her not by the making of vows, for the vows had been made in October, and had not, at that season, been meant by either party, but by the observation of what a person does, when she believes no person to be observing her, in a house that has given her no reason to be kind, and every reason to be cold. He said that he had found her, in that observation, to be the person he had, in the whole of his life, most wished to know. He said this without raising his voice. He said it looking at Corisande, and he said, at the end, that he was, from this hour, at his wife's side, and that any person present who wished, in future, to speak of her, in his hearing or out of it, would, he requested, spare themselves the trouble of pretending to speak of her out of kindness. He inclined his head to Corisande. He offered his arm to Marin. Marin took his arm, and they walked, together, the length of the ballroom, which was, though no person had ever measured it, 45 feet, and which they crossed as though it were a river that had, for 2 years, run cold between one bank and the other, and which was, in the crossing, forded, and Corisande, who did not weep, but who was, at that moment, for the first time in her life, seen in the light as she was, small and cornered and afraid, stood alone in the middle of the room, and understood that she had been, from the beginning, the smallest figure in a story much larger than her own, and would not, again, be seated at any table on the strength of her position at any other. The company parted before them, without a sound, and they went out into the hall, and out into the courtyard, and Marin, in the carriage, in the dark, and without turning her head, said only that she had not, all evening, taken the count of the paintings in the ballroom, of which there had been 11, and the Duke said, in the flat voice he kept for facts, that there had been 12, and that she had missed one behind the door. And she did smile then, all the way to the beginning of a smile and past it, and the smile did finish, and he saw it finish, and he understood at last what he had been watching for. He had not, however, spoken. He was a man who had, 7 years before, made a promise to a stone that he would not, again, love a person he could not defend, and he had learned that defending was a longer business than loving, and he did not, at Marchmoor, mistake the defense for the declaration. That came 3 nights later, upon the eve of the day Mr. Prine had been summoned to the library to answer for the pencil marks in the second book, which he had, on being summoned, answered by handing to the Duke a paper on which he had written, in his own tidy, tired hand, the sum of his 10 years of small, tidy fear, and by asking, in a voice that had, at last, stopped being flat, whether the Duke would permit him to sell his cottage in the village, and to make what restitution such a sum permitted, before he laid the rest of himself, in disgrace, into whatever hands the Duke should nominate. The Duke had heard him out. The Duke had looked at the paper. The Duke had, for the length of time it takes a clock to strike the quarter, been silent. He had then said, in a voice a shade less flat than the flat voice, that Mr. Prine would sell the cottage, and would make what restitution the sum permitted, and would then remain in his office at Hollowmere until such time as the young mistress of the house, who had, by her own hand upon a small piece of paper, first uncovered the matter, should be satisfied that the accounts had, in every column, been made to agree with their neighbors, and that after that time Mr. Prine should be permitted to retire to his sister, and to nurse her, and to say to no person of the county, on his part, why he had gone, and that the young mistress of the house would say to no person of the county, on her part, either, Mr. Prine had wept then, which he had not done in the memory of any person living, and had said, in the voice that had stopped being flat, that the young mistress had, from the moment she had turned in the library and told him that no harm was done, the mercy of a person he had not, in his life, deserved, and had gone out. and the Duke had sat a long time at his desk after Mr. Prine had gone. He had opened the small locked drawer. He had taken out the folded letter. He had, at last, opened it. He had read it once. He had folded it. He had put it back. He had locked the drawer. He had, in doing so, not said the name of the woman who had written it, but had said it in the silence of his own head, one last time, and had said with it a small, quiet good. And he had risen, and had gone through the corridors of his own house to the small parlor, where he knew, at that hour, his wife would be at her mending, and he had gone in without knocking, because knocking is a thing done between strangers, and he had stopped in the doorway. She had risen. He had said, in a voice unlike the flat voice, and unlike a shade less flat than the flat voice, and unlike any voice he had used in her hearing before, her name. He had said only her name. He had said Marin. She had, at the sound of it, put down the mending, and she had said, in the clear, steady voice of a girl who had decided, in advance, that she would not weep, and who wept, and did not care. His name. She had said Ewan, and the two of them, standing on the two sides of a small parlor at Hollowmere in February, on the night when Mr. Prine had been forgiven, and the letter had at last been opened, and the county at Marchmoor had, 3 nights before, been silenced, took, at last, the 7 years of names that had lain between them, and put them down. And he crossed the room, and he took her hand, and he did not, for a great while, let it go, and no other thing that need be told of that evening will be told here, for the rest was quiet, and the quiet belonged to them. Of what came after the county said, for a season all that the county says, and then, as counties do, ceased to say it, for a rumor whose mouth has been named cannot travel farther than the length of that mouth. Corisande Vane went, in the spring, to a cousin in the capital, and did not, that year or any other, return to Marchmoor for the season, and was, in due course, married, to a man of a large fortune and a small conversation, and was, in the county's judgment, neither happy nor unhappy, but occupied, and she was not spoken of at Hollowmere, though she was not, when named, condemned. For the Duke had, at some private hour, asked his wife whether she thought Corisande had known, in her own heart, what she had been doing, and Marin had said, in the clear, steady voice, that she thought Corisande had known, and had thought also that Corisande had, since 15, been so afraid of being small that she had never dared to be still long enough to find out whether she was. And the Duke had inclined his head, and had not spoken of her again, save to send, one Christmas, a small, quiet gift to her house, which was received without acknowledgment and, so far as any person knew, not opened. Mr. Prine sold his cottage, made his restitution, went, upon the appointed day, to his sister, nursed her 3 years, buried her, and lived himself 2 years longer in the town, tidying, at the end, only his own small tidy things, and it was told at Hollowmere, upon the arrival of the letter that spoke of his death, that he had asked, on his last day, that the young mistress of Hollowmere be told that the columns had, in his heart, been made to agree with their neighbors, and that he was grateful, and Marin, upon hearing this, went into the small parlor, and sat a long while with the letter in her lap, and did not weep, and did not, that evening, mend anything, which was, in her, a great grief. The Duke's mother, who had for a whole winter believed a rumor she ought not to have believed, did what such mothers do when they have believed what they ought not to have believed, which is that she said, once, to the young mistress, in the corridor outside the small drawing-room, that she had been wrong, and the young mistress said, in the clear, steady voice, that she had not, and they took tea together, that afternoon, at the same table, for the first time, and thereafter the tea was not weak, and no person remarked upon it, and the Duke's mother lived 7 years more, and saw in her last spring a grandchild upon the knee of the son she had, for a season, believed cold, and died, in her chair by the fire content. Mrs. Denner remained at Hollowmere until her strength failed her, which was in the 11th year, and refused, in that time, to accept any addition to her small wages, and asked only, upon her retirement, that the young mistress should visit her, upon a Sunday, in the small cottage in the village that had been given her for her use, and did receive that visit, and every Sunday after, until such time as she was buried in the churchyard beside her husband, whom no person in the household had ever heard her mention, and the cook, who had lost 3 of her own and had refused to lose a 4th, remained in the kitchen for so long as she could stand at the range, and taught the young mistress, by degrees, everything a cook can teach a duchess about the folding of a napkin, so that a small piece of bread which is not in the order may be included in it, and both of them understood, without saying so, that the teaching had begun on the 2nd evening of the marriage and had never, in truth, stopped. The groom of whom the report had been made was given, in the spring, a raise, and, in the summer, a horse of his own, and, in the autumn, a wife, and did not, in his life, know why the Duke of Hollowmere had, upon the wedding day, come himself to the small chapel to see him married, and had not asked, being a groom, and not a person who asks. The small silver teapot was, in the 5th year, sent to be resilvered, and returned, and was set upon the sideboard at breakfast in a room that was, by then, kept warm, and Marin polished it each dawn with her own hands, until the 3rd child was old enough to reach the sideboard, and then taught the child to polish it, and taught the child also, without saying so, the reason. There were 4 children in the end, and there were, in the whole of the marriage, 2 great griefs, of which the first was a child born in the 7th year who did not live the winter, and the second was the loss of the Duke's mother, and Marin carried them as she had learned, at 17, to carry what could not be kept, and did not pretend, in her happiness, that she did not carry them. For she had married a man who had, in the 7th year of his grief, told her that the promise he had made to a small stone in a small yard had been not a wall around his heart, but a door with a very small key, and that the key had at last been given, and had opened not the old room, but a room he had not before her known was there, and she had understood, in his saying so, that the dead do not return, and that the lost years do not return, and that some doors, however honestly they are knocked upon, stay shut, and that a happiness that pretended otherwise would not be worth the polishing of a teapot. She and the Duke went, in every August of their marriage, upon a day of no particular date, to a small chapel in a town 2 days' ride away, and stood, together, before a small stone in a small yard, and said aloud whatever needed that year to be said, and Marin, in the standing, did not consider herself either less loved for the stone or more loved without it, and understood that the stone was, in some part, the ground upon which her own happiness had, at last, been permitted to be built, and honored it accordingly. Grief did not go out of the house at Hollowmere with the coming of joy. It moved to a smaller room, and kept its door open, and was, upon occasion, visited, and was not, upon any occasion, denied, in the 5th year, upon a morning in October that was the anniversary of the day upon which no bells had rung and no breakfast had been served. The Duke came into the breakfast room at the appointed hour, and found his wife at the sideboard with the small silver teapot in both hands, though there was, by then, a footman for the tea, and no need, and he stood in the doorway a moment, watching her, in the manner of a man who has, at last, learned to notice the warmth at his elbow before he warms his hands at it. And he came forward. And he took the teapot from her, in both his hands, because both were required, and he set it upon the table at her place, which had, from the second year, been at his right, and he drew out her chair. She sat. He poured her tea, and he set the small silver spoon precisely across the cup at the angle he preferred, which was by then the angle she preferred also, and the county, if the county had been looking in at the window, would have said only that the Duke of Hollowmere had grown, in his happiness, a shade more ordinary than the county had once feared. But the county was not looking in at the window, for the county had, by then, learned that there was nothing in that window to see that it had not already misunderstood. The teapot, which had been silver once, and had, in a certain slant of morning light, remembered it, was now silver again, and did not need to remember, and it stood upon a table at which the person who polished it was also the person who was served from it, and the two facts, which had once lain apart, now lay together, and between them ran no debt at all. If there is a lesson in any of this, it is only that the coldest room in a house is not the room in which no fire has been lit, but the room in which a fire has been lit and refused, and that the smallest hand tending the smallest light in the smallest room may, if she does not permit any wind at any door to blow it out, in time warm the whole house and every person in it. And even the man who had, at the outset, believed himself the master of all its cold. Kindness given where none is owed is the only debt in the world that pays itself, and dignity kept where none is shown is the only fortune that cannot be spent. Be then the hand upon the second candle in the winter kitchen, be the person who does not drop the teapot, and the house, at last, will be warm. Thank you for listening to this story all the way to the end. Tell us in the comments which city you are watching from and what this story made you feel. And do not forget to subscribe so you will not miss the next story.